Emeritus of Gun Owners of America, Mr. Larry Pratt. Let's hear it for Mr. Pratt, everybody.
Well, thank you so much. It's good to be here again in the American part of Massachusetts. I was expecting a checkpoint where we would have to present passports, but we haven't quite gotten to that yet here, I guess. The Second Amendment is a subject which stirs, we'll put it this way, it kind of pops vessels in liberal heads. They really don't like the idea of an armed people. And when they express that, I point out to them that we've heard that before. The British had the same view. They didn't like an armed people either. And it didn't turn out well for them. They should have taken a hint before it was delivered. It's kind of politically incorrect, and that point of view is labeled by the politically correct as insurrectionist. Okay, if you like that word, we can use that. It was an insurrection against tyranny that made us what we are, or what we used to be, and hopefully what we still can be, is a country under God, operating under a constitution which doesn't change every time there's a meeting of the Congress. The Congress really is not a sitting constitutional convention, in spite of what so many of the members of Congress think. The history that we have in this country is almost intrinsically, it's just, you have trouble separating it from the whole idea of an armed people. It's almost in today's world now a unique concept that the American people are the sovereign of the United States of America. And as a sovereign, they've got to be armed. They've got to be able to impose their will if, say, their employees called the government come against the sovereign. That's what was established clearly in 18th century America when the British were, among other things, trying to keep the colonists from being able to have access to powder and ball, ammunition. They were trying to disarm the colonists in that fashion. In fact, in Boston at one point, General Gage, the British commissar, if you will, had actually confiscated guns. If you were going to be in Boston, you could not have a gun. And of course, he promised to give it to you when you left. Right. Well, I would submit that the American War for Independence, while it certainly was involved with the notion of objecting to taxation without representation, what it really was about, more than any of the other issues, and there were multiple issues, but I would say the main issue was gun control. After all, what was it that sparked the fight at Lexington, not too far from here? It was the fact that the Brits wanted the guns in the municipal armory, wanted the ball and powder, I should say, in the municipal armory. And after they were able to scatter the ragtag boys at Lexington, they went on to Concord, where they were repulsed by a militia. A militia repulsed the biggest army, the most powerful army in the world at that time. But it kept going like that. That was not the only expression of the importance of the militia in the history of our country. If you, well, let me just back up. Not only were guns obviously involved in that militia, but people wouldn't have been willing to be part of that militia. They wouldn't have been willing to suffer marching through the snow in Valley Forge that winter, leaving bloody footprints, had it not been for the belief in an idea that was being preached with increasing regularity by maybe a minority, but a substantial minority of the clergy of the country. And this was a part of the colonies that was as dedicated to that kind of preaching as any. It may not be so today, but it was then. And the idea was that submission to tyranny is an evil thing, and that it should be resisted. And that's what was in the mind of the men who stood on Lexington Green that April morning. They were there because their pastor, Jonah Clark, was there with them. He was one of that handful of ragtag militiamen that was practicing what he had been preaching. Well, when it moved over to Concord, there was a little bit more time to organize, and the Brits were repulsed. And it was stunning that the imperial power of the day, the supreme imperial power, had been repulsed by a bunch of farmers and shopkeepers. That's who they were. And when the question is arrogantly asked, and it was at that time, what do you seriously think you can accomplish against the British Army? Well, April 19 provided an answer to that. We can do a lot because we're pretty good shots, and we can shoot your officers right between the eyes. And that's what the militia training was all about. These guys were incredibly good shots, and they were willing to put their lives on the line. One of the men at Lexington that day, probably that morning, died in his house right off the green in his wife's arms. That is something that takes an idea to motivate somebody to be willing to do that. And then to go on the rest of the day after having seen that and still be willing to stand up to that tyrant and his force. That's an idea. And it was an idea that was being promoted by one writer who is a pastor in Oklahoma, has been a state representative, actually he's running for governor now, Dan Fisher, has called them the Black Robe Regiment. And George III knew what the Black Robe Regiment was when he was speaking about what he feared most about the happenings in America. He said, it's the Black Robe Regiment. It's the clergy. They're behind all of this. I wonder if we will come to a time again in America when the clergy might be behind it again. It would be nice to hear them talk about the limitations on government, that civil government is not the last word. A Supreme Court ruling is not, and even under our Constitution, is not the last word. It's the opinion of one of three equal branches, supposedly equal branches. And it's only our mistaken deference that has elevated in some people's minds the Supreme Court to a position of superior rank in our federal system. They are not. Well, one of the battle cries that was not uncommon, even here in Massachusetts and Virginia, up and down the colonies, as men would march into battle, if they were, in my opinion, ill-advised enough to march into battle as opposed to shoot from behind stone walls and trees and things of that sort, which is really what took the toll of the British that morning of April 19, or that afternoon. As they retreated back to Boston, that's when they suffered most of their casualties, which was about a quarter of the 800 men they had sent out that morning. And it was all being done by marksmen sneakily hiding behind trees and not meeting them in the road like men. Well, we saw who the real men were, because the real men were there at Yorktown waving goodbye as the Brits marched up the gangplank in total surrender, and their band playing a popular song of the time, "The World Turned Upside Down." I would say we need to turn the world upside down again. So the Black Robe Regiment was what really turned the world upside down. You can look at countries in Europe and other parts of the world. My wife is from Panama. They own guns, privately owned guns there. But the big difference is that when my wife cast the one vote that she cast in Panama before becoming a U.S. citizen, she saw the government troops cart off the ballot boxes, and the government-approved candidate was declared the victor that night. When they try to do something like that here in America, such as in Athens, Tennessee in 1946, the police illegally took the ballot boxes from the polling places to their police station at the end of the voting day. And they were going to, if you will, count the ballots there that day. Well, as a Soviet mass murderer Joseph Stalin said, I don't care who votes, I just want to be in charge of who counts the votes. And my wife's experience was just that. She cast a vote, no problem, go right ahead, man. But she didn't get to count the votes, and nobody on the unofficial side got to count the votes. So here in America, the people can make sure that they count the vote. Think of Athens, Tennessee in 1946. The cops actually were carrying off the ballot boxes, but something that wouldn't have happened in Panama and doesn't happen in other countries happened in Athens, Tennessee. They'd kind of expected that the corruptocrats that were running the town might abscond with the ballot boxes. So about an hour after the close of voting, the ballot boxes had already been illegally removed to the police station for quote-unquote counting. The militia, rather unorganized, but nevertheless a militia, citizens with guns rode into town in their farm vehicles and their automobiles, and they surrounded the cop shop. There was a brief shootout, and the police realized there were way too many of the citizens as to them, and they surrendered. Yay. That was the big difference between stealing an election in Athens, Tennessee, and in Panama, Central America.
Who didn't even get to steal it?
So, the militia was still really alive and well, well into the 19th century. The War of 1812, excuse me, was actually finally put to an end right outside of New Orleans, where the British were attempting to make a flank run, come up the Mississippi and attack what was most of the United States then from the west. Well, it was a great strategy, except it didn't work because this guy called Andrew Jackson came out of Tennessee, ultimately ended up in the White House, but he led two militia companies from Tennessee and from Kentucky. And these good old boys met the Brits on the field of battle and whooped them. The British Empire had lost again in America, and I would say that was really the end of our war for independence. Thanks so much. The British finally had to acknowledge that they were not going to tame the American forces, that the American people just had too much orneriness in them. Well, I sure hope we're still ornery enough today.
We'll get there.
I had been wondering, as we turned the corner into this century, whether America still had that spirit. You don't really know until you see something actually occur. Well, I would argue that we saw the militia come back into service 4 years ago in Bunkerville, Nevada, where the Bundy Ranch was surrounded by a bunch of thugs from the federal government called the Bureau of Land Management. And we can go into that story, but I understand Eamon Bundy is here, so he'll explain much better than I could about the details of what happened there. Suffice it to say that after the standoff began, after the assault of the feds began, people began coming from around the state, then from around the region, and ultimately from around the country. And this touched me personally, even though I never was in Bunkerville, but I almost was. I got a call Saturday morning before a Monday news conference had been scheduled at the ranch. And the head of the Oath Keepers called to say that the news conference has been canceled. What are you talking about? I said, well, the feds just melted away this morning. This was like 7:30 Pacific time that I got this call. And so it turned out that there were so many Americans on their way or had already gotten to Bunkerville that somebody with a little sense in his head realized that, yeah, we could wipe them out right now, but if we do that, it probably would start the Second American Civil War. And they weren't ready to do that because we live here and they're our neighbors, and it wasn't going to end well if they weren't good neighbors, if you get what I mean. So as I understand it, there were a bunch of unarmed men and women ranchers walking toward a barbed wire corral that had been thrown up impromptu to contain some of the cattle that the feds were fixing to steal. And it was then that a deputy sheriff rode out and asked the head of the BLM, do you want to be known as the folks that have killed unarmed men and women in America? And the guy had enough of a conscience that apparently that got him to lower his gun, and the others followed suit, and they rode off. And that's when I got the call shortly after that saying that the news conference was over, that the American militia had won once again against a government gone awry. The very purpose of the Second Amendment is to contain that, keep it from happening. You know, we used to have a federal law. Our first Militia Act, and I believe the second one as well into the 19th century, required ownership of a military long gun, musket, and later rifle. And that, for some time, was the Swiss idea as well, every man a rifle. Now, I was recently in Switzerland, and I was saddened to learn that, yeah, every man in Switzerland is part of the Swiss military, drafted in, and they're given a Swiss military automatic firearm, machine gun, but it's illegal for them to have any of that ammunition at home. Well, you know, so they've got an 8-pound paperweight, big deal. That's not really a terrifying notion. At least I didn't think so. And I think that kind of indicates what was happening, and maybe we should pay attention to what happened in Switzerland, because they were trying to be part of the politically correct arrangement of their day in Europe, the European Union. And the European Union is militantly opposed to citizens owning and having and certainly carrying firearms. If you're going to have a gun in Europe, it's going to be highly regulated. In some places you even have to keep it at a club, can't even have it at home. And the idea of a militia is as foreign in Europe as it is in Panama. America is truly an exceptional country where we really believe that the sovereign should be armed. One of the fathers of our War for Independence was John Adams. And he said something that I just recently discovered that I thought said an awful lot about what I've been trying to get across here. He said that 10 years before the shots were fired at Lexington, the American Revolution was born in the minds of the people. And that's what the clergy were doing. That's what the newspapers of the day, which were a single sheet usually published on a weekly basis, and the editorial was usually a sermon from some clergyman the Sunday before. So instead of an internet, they had these weekly broadsides which put out these inflammatory sermons, using the British view of it, that stoked the fires of liberty in what became the United States. You know, it's interesting that occasionally you see little glimmers of this same notion of the importance of an armed people, even in other countries. In the early 80s, I had traveled a few times to Guatemala. And in speaking with people there, particularly up in the highlands, the women typically are not involved in commerce, so they don't even speak Spanish. So I had to speak to the men. But the men were involved in self-defense patrols that had been established by the military junta, and particularly one man who is reviled by the left in this country, which ought to be a signal that this was a man, as we've had in our time. And retired General Efraín Ríos Montt had been brought into this junta shortly after they took power. He was a widely respected man, had been the head of the Guatemalan military some time before, had actually been exiled by making him an ambassador in Europe so that he wouldn't stir things up. But he got back to Guatemala and he was stirring things up. And what was happening in Guatemala was that the communists through Cuba and ultimately from the then Soviet Union were trying to stir things up in Guatemala and turn the people against the military so that they could then overturn the government and establish a communist government in Guatemala. Well, it didn't work out quite as they had hoped. It was getting to be very serious. And the military didn't really know who was who. And there were times when the military did some pretty bad things. Because they didn't know who was the good guys and who was the bad guys. Rios Montt, a deeply Christian man, was unique in his view among the Guatemalan leadership, ruling class, that these folks in the highland are people too. And we need to be working with them. And what he did was to give them antique rifles. And they were, you know, for everybody here that might own a gun, they were a joke. But in Guatemala, they were a whole lot better than a machete. And it inspired the people, both with the confidence that had been expressed in them by Rios Montt and by the simple possession of a real gun. Probably, these things weighed 8 or 10 pounds. I wouldn't want to carry them very long myself. And then they would shoot one shot and you had to reload manually. But nevertheless, it was so much ahead of whatever they had that it did inspire the people in the highlands where the communist insurgency was being fomented to stand against the communists and to work with the government. And the people in the highlands began to inform on the guerrillas, and ultimately, using that intelligence, the military was able to force the guerrillas into a small area and just mow them down. And it broke the back of the guerrilla insurgency, because the government had finally decided that the people have to be brought into the governing process. And once that was done, and once they were armed, which is a very tangible signal that we need to work together, things changed rather quickly in Guatemala. And the left has never forgiven Rios Montt, because he showed that when you actually do believe the people, as opposed to the talk that the left talks, when you actually do something such as what that guy did, things can change. And they don't change the way the left wants, because once the people are with the government, with the establishment, once the establishment is with the people, perhaps better said, things change. I saw the same thing in the Philippines, and in the Philippines it wasn't even as top down. In the Philippines under President Marcos, a dictator, things were pretty bad and there was a lot of opposition, and finally maybe 1 million people in one of the downtown areas of the Philippine capital tumbled that government. The military just couldn't see themselves going in and mowing down thousands and thousands of people who were peacefully demonstrating against the dictatorship. What had enabled them to do that and to challenge even the military in the Philippines was the illegal manufacture of AR-15s and 9mm handguns, and they were themselves arming their own, what they called the alza masa, the rising of the people. And the people rose and the dictator fell. And yes, it was ideas, and this was being actively promoted in the churches, as it was in Guatemala too, by the way. It was in largely evangelical churches in the highlands that the ideas of liberty were being preached. And it was the same idea in the steamy environment of the Philippines. That these same ideas were being preached, and again they were being preached from pulpits. And the people then were able to tell the military and ultimately the dictatorship, you're finished. And Imelda Marcos had to leave her thousands of shoes behind as they fled the country. Bad things happen to all kinds of people. The debate today in our country may be a measure of how far we've come from the idea of celebrating an armed people and seeing the contribution to liberty that an armed people has made and can make once we really stick to that notion. Somehow now it's debatable. In fact, I've gotten eye rolls when I've made the suggestion repeatedly that a teacher that is willing to do so be armed so that that teacher can protect the students that are in that classroom. And I remember when I was on Piers Morgan's show, and he thought that I was you are a very stupid man. I thought, what are you saying? Do you like the idea of piling the dead bodies of students up against the schoolyard fence? Is that something you really like to see? Because that's what your policies are bringing. The idea of an unarmed people is a deadly idea. And you, Mr. Morgan, are part of the problem. Well, we didn't part good friends. I tried to do that, and one of my last words were, well, my friend, you just got to look at the sources that I've been pointing to. You are not my friend. So, and I guess not. We've never had a beer together, so it's probably not going to happen. Facts seem to bounce off the heads of the Piers Morgans of the world, the liberals, if you will. Just because he's British, we shouldn't think that we're exempt from having people threaten our freedoms here in our own country. But they want to walk right past the very clear data that tell us that 98% of the mass murders in our country, many of them taking place in schools, occur in gun-free zones. And they want to celebrate gun-free? What is it, that they love death? They hate life? I think maybe that's what it is. And we've got to point that out to them, that they hate life. They are not the defenders of life. They are not the defenders of diversity. They are wannabe dictators that would impose their deadly views on a whole country that heretofore has resisted that kind of thinking since we told the British to go back to London. It's a dangerous way of thinking. Look at what happened in Broward County, Florida, where the Parkland School is located. The sheriff in charge of the Broward Cowards presided over a force that bravely waited, hiding behind cars and other obstacles while the shooting was going on in the school, and only went into the school after the shooting had stopped. What bravery. What an answer to the call of duty. Wow. And we're to rely for our lives and our freedom on people like that? Please, don't bless me with such protection. Just as another instance of how the militia has worked in our country, think of this. If you were to ask the arm of the Democrat Party called the KKK what they think of the Deacons for Defense, by now they probably don't even know who the Deacons were. But the Deacons, and I've met some black conservative leaders who didn't know who the Deacons had been. But back in the 60s, the Deacons for Defense rose out of black churches, although they were hardly, at the end of the day, all deacons. But these black men decided that these goofy pacifist civil rights workers coming from the North needed to be protected or they were all going to get murdered by the Democrats in the South. And so they formed the Deacons for Defense. And it sprang up, never was chartered, never was incorporated, but the Deacons for Defense saved an awful lot of lives because they were literally riding shotgun for these northern civil rights workers. That is something that I think needs to be pointed out whenever we're debating somebody from the other side. Those who are against an armed people are those who are proponents of tyranny, They are the proponents of the KKK point of view. Maybe they wouldn't join today, but that's where the Democrat Party was born, where the KKK came from as an action arm to keep those people under control. That was a Democrat Party initiative. Might as well have been part of their national platform. And I think we need to hold them to that. We need to demand that they renounce the racist roots of the anti-gun point of view in America. The opposition to an armed people and racism go together like a hand and glove. And they don't have a leg to stand on, and we need to make sure that nobody props them up.
Right.
Let's leave it at this. America is not like other nations in so many ways. One of the key differences between us and other nations is that we're not based on any ethnicity. America's based on an idea. America's based on the idea that everybody is under God, including the government. And that has nothing to do with the fact that you might have had ancestors come from Sweden or from Uganda. It just doesn't matter. As long as that American idea unites us, America is going to continue to be a great force for freedom and liberty in the world. And hopefully America is on its way back. Hopefully we're seeing before us another rise of the celebration of freedom in this country and a rejection of the British notion that only certain people ought to be ruling. We sent them packing at Yorktown. I think we sent them packing back in 2016 during our elections. Let's hope that nobody pulls up the gangplank until they're all aboard the ships, taking them back home. Thanks.
Huzzah!